Thank you. Good evening. I'm Roxana Markoch, acting chief curator and the David Beckman senior curator of photography at the Museum of Modern Art, and it is my greatest pleasure to welcome you all to this evening's Forum on Contemporary Photography dedicated to democracy, race, and the power of images. Our program is a collaboration between the Museum of Modern Art, Aperture, and Vision and Justice, a catalytic civic initiative that generates original research, curricula, and programs to reveal how aesthetic encounters have shaped and continue to shape public trajectories of identity, community, and politics. I had the honor of co-organizing this forum with Sarah Lewis, who is the founder of Vision and Justice, and the John Loeb Associate Professor of the Humanities and Associate Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard University, Michael Famighetti, Editor-in-Chief at Aperture, and Caitlin Ryan, Assistant Curator of Photography at the Museum of Modern Art. And so on behalf of us all, we extend our sincerest thanks to those whose expert knowledge and skill have made this evening possible, of course, the speakers. And also, hats off to our colleagues in the photography department, Marion Trondet, manager, and Megan Fengel, coordinator, as well as MoMA's exceptional audiovisual team. We are very grateful to the Black Arts Council for generously hosting a reception immediately following the forum, to which you are all invited. This convening coincides with the publication of two electrifying new contributions to the field. Sarah Lewis's highly anticipated volume, The Unseen Truth, How Race Changed Sight in America, was recently published by Harvard University Press, and offers a probing analysis of the fictions that have long secured our regime of racial hierarchy in the United States. Aperture's anthology, Race Stories, Essay on the Power of Images, collects the award-winning short essays of the late critic, curator, and influential cultural historian Maurice Berger. From 2012 to 2019, Maurice served as a monthly contributor to the New York Times Lens blog, resulting in a body of incisive essays on the relationship between photography and race, which touch on nearly every facet of the medium from the 19th century to the 21st. Edited by curator and writer Marvin Heiferman, Maurice's longtime partner, with contributions by Henry Louis Gates Jr., Dawoud Bey, Nona Faustin, and Peter Kundhart Jr., Race Stories is the first title in Aperture's Vision and Justice series, created and co-edited by Sarah Lewis, Leigh Raiford, and Deborah Willis, and advised by a board of preeminent artists, creators, and scholars, many of whom we are very privileged to have with us tonight. At the end of the introduction of his 2010 book, For All the World to See, Visual Culture and the Struggle for Civil Rights, Maurice characterizes the representation of the crucial equal rights legislation era of the mid-1950s to the late 1960s by writing, quote, "The leaders of the civil rights movement and their vigilant enemies were often exceptionally gifted image makers. They understood and took advantage of the complex relationship between innovative technologies for representing the world and the society eager for new ways of seeing. Innumerable efforts were made to prove or disprove the idea that racism was a scourge that imperiled both democracy and the future of America," unquote. Maurice's trenchant observation hits on the inextricable relationship between images and civic engagement, and the truth that pictures have the capacity to transform perception of the past, present, and future in ways both reactionary and emancipatory. In these, Maurice's words resonate with Sarah Lewis's opening lines and powerful thesis that, quote, "Race changed sight in America. The transformation, difficult to observe, has led to a way of seeing that is now so practiced that this very fact can seem unremarkable. It is this transformation of vision that let obvious fictions remain at the basis of the racial project and settle into a kind of truth, unquote. By tracing this history, Sarah offers us a path to resist the erasure and negation that shaped vision and imagines a more complex, nuanced, and racially inclusive story and history of photography. Framed by Maurice and Sarah's meditation on race and representation in the United States, is especially urgent during this consequential election season. Tonight's forum brings together a robust lineup, both in person with us and via video, to explore the role of art criticism and visual culture in examining the ongoing work of social justice, equity, and democracy in the 21st century. To leave as much time as possible for discussion, which I know will be a rich one, we are foregoing the usual introductions and transitions today. Instead, we invite you to review the presenter's bios on the program that was handed out as you entered. 3 of our presenters will be joining us from farther away locations and have pre-recorded their talks. I will turn over the podium to 2 back-to-back pre-recorded opening statements by Ava DuVernay and Sherrilyn Ifill. So please join me in welcoming Ava and Sherrilyn.
Thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. I'm Ava DuVernay, and I'm a storyteller. One rule of storytelling, if you remember nothing else, start strong, end strong. So I'll begin strong with one of my favorite quotes by Maestro Baldwin. He wrote, "The world changes according to the way people see it. And if you alter even by a millimeter the way people see and look at reality, you can change reality." I'm incredibly pleased to be a small part of this important forum, Democracy, Race, and the Power of Images, because they alter our reality, because it represents a vital conversation that could alter how we understand our place in the world today. So since MoMA's photography department was founded in 1940, the museum has continuously pushed boundaries, championing photography as a legitimate form of art, even when others fail to see its potential. By showcasing works like New Photography 2 in 1986, featuring color photography when it was still dismissed as commercial, MoMA has helped shape the trajectory of artists and the art world as a whole. But today, we're discussing photography's deeper impact, its capacity to interrogate issues of race, justice, and democracy. This forum, organized alongside the release of 2 groundbreaking books, Race Story by Maurice Berger and The Unseen Truth by my sister Sarah Elizabeth Lewis, is a perfect platform to explore how images frame our narratives around race and equity. Now, these 2 works are critical. They offer a critical lens through which we can consider the intersections of race, visual culture, and the ongoing fight for social justice. And I'm especially excited to hear from today's esteemed speakers, Dawoud Bey, Sherrilyn Ifill, Deborah Willis, just to name a few. These people continue to lead the conversation on the role of art in this dialogue. I so wish I could be there with you, but trust that this convening will be dynamic and unforgettable. And in the spirit of ending strong, Maestro Baldwin wrote, "Our history is each other. That is our only guide." So may you be guided to a place of introspection and connection today, and enjoy.
Hi, my name is Sherrilyn Ifill, and many of you know that I have been a fellow at MoMA for a year. My fellowship just ended in August. And during that fellowship, I have had the great pleasure of trying to work on a project that I've been thinking about for a very long time, pulling together the work of social justice activists and civil rights lawyers like myself with artists who are, in my view, doing some of the most important work that is necessary for helping us all reimagine a new American democracy. So you can imagine that tonight's forum would be catnip for me. but I'm very sorry I can't be with you. What makes it even more distressing to me that I'm not going to be part of this conversation tonight is that a focus of the discussion is the extraordinary new book by Sarah Lewis, The Unseen Truth: How Race Changed Sight in America. I did a wonderful event with Darren Walker and with Sarah several weeks ago that I thought was a wonderful and important conversation about the book because the book itself is so important. It's an amazing work of scholarship that opens up a new portal, a new way, and a new focus of history to help us think about how our thinking and seeing and understanding of race has been shaped in this country. And I believe this is critical work to our ability to grapple with the role of race in our democracy, to understand how we have gotten to where we are. And Sarah Lewis does so much of that work for us. From Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, the most photographed man of the 19th century, who powerfully understood the importance of image to our ideas about what constitutes a man and who can be a citizen of this country, to today, when we are bombarded with images that purport to distort citizenship, distort womanhood and manhood, distort personhood in our country, when we fight every day for an understanding of dignity and humanity that is worthy of the words democracy. This book is an important contribution to that ongoing discussion. For me, it's critically important because I have come to confirm through my work as a fellow at MoMA that we must be arm in arm, civil rights lawyers, social justice warriors, and artists in the powerful work not of preserving our democracy or defending our democracy, but of reimagining our democracy to finally create at long last the country we truly want, one we can be proud to live in, one that reflects the highest values that we embrace. This is the most noble work of patriotism, of citizenship, and of democracy, and it is not work that should be left to lawyers and politicians. And so to read Sarah Lewis's work, and of course not just this book, but much of her earlier work as well, that so powerfully engages these issues has been a revelation for me. I know talking about her new book is going to be a revelation for you tonight. And again, I'm sorry that I can't be with you, but I wish you the very best. I salute Roxana and the entire photography team. I was privileged to sit in their space and overhear their conversations and just marvel at their level of knowledge and scholarship and professional care in their work. I was deeply inspired by what they do. So I hope you have a wonderful evening tonight. Thank you for letting me be a part of it even in this way, and I wish you all the very best.
Good evening. It's such a pleasure and a true honor to be here with you all today at a forum, an exchange, a near seminar about democracy, race, and image making in the United States. It was a privilege to hold a curatorial position here some years ago, working with the wonderful Roxana Markoch and the entire photography department, which has grown since then, and with the Black Arts Council that I'm honored is holding a reception for all of us at the end of this event. I want to also recognize those who I was also privileged to learn from while here. Foremost among them, Glenn Lowry, the director of the museum, thank you. Agnes Gund for her leadership and stewardship, and those who I spot but can't quite fully make out. There's so many colleagues I had here. Thank you all for coming. My deepest gratitude goes to those whose labor made this event possible, and to all of you who came, including my parents. Ironically, what brings me back today is a question that forced me away from MoMA in the year 2007. It was a question I wanted to pursue through research. What is the role of art and culture for justice in American democracy? Answering this question led me on what feels like a near odyssey of the last 10 years, brought me to Harvard University, where I now teach, and to the work of founding the Vision and Justice Initiative. What is the role of art and culture for justice and democracy? The works we're exploring tonight are born of the headwaters of this unanswered question, first asked, I would argue, by Frederick Douglass. In 1861, at Boston's Tremont Temple, not far from where I teach now, he delivered a speech that stunned his audience, expecting to hear anything other than a lecture about what would have seemed like a trifle in the state of that nation-severing conflict, namely pictures, and the power they had to ignite the critical imagination required for progress in the United States. He redrafted this speech, Pictures in Progress, 3 different times over the course of his life, as I imagine him doing so in his study in his final home in Anacostia. Why? He understood that images were becoming weapons used to both honor human life and to deliberately denigrate it, to reify the racial regime and hierarchy we are struggling to undo and dislodge today. As you heard Sherrilyn Ifill mention, he did become the most photographed American man in the 19th century, not African American man, but American man. And he understood in that act the power of representation itself in a representational democracy. He too understood that the new medium, this new technology, had the capacity to show what had been unseen, glimpsed, then disregarded, namely the very humanity of all in the United States. The unfinished work of Douglass's speech launched the Vision and Justice Initiative. It was born of the core curriculum course I am privileged to teach at Harvard and the issue of Aperture magazine that I guest edited in 2016, thanks to really the generosity of Michael Famighetti, who's also here today. The 2 covers, the Richard Avedon image of king, father, and son, and the contemporary image by the photographer Awal Arezku, who is with us tonight, remind us of the historical roots and the contemporary urgency of these ideas. Douglass anticipated so much of what would come. How many movements began when a work of extraordinary power and artwork transformed our perceptions of the world entirely and launched the social justice movements we live with today? More times than we could possibly know, but I'd like to offer you one example that I learned about while I was here at the Museum of Modern Art. A young boy named Charles Black Jr. went to a dance and found himself just transfixed by the sound coming out of the horn, Louis Armstrong, King of the Trumpet. And the year was 1931 in Austin, Texas. He was so struck by the mastery of Louis Armstrong, shown to you here in a photograph by Lizette Modell, that he understood in that moment that segregation, the law of the land around him, the Jim Crow rule around him, must be wrong, because there was genius coming out of the body of a man whom the world around him had denigrated. He began, as he writes, walking towards justice that day as a young 16-year-old freshman at Austin High. He would go on to become one of the lawyers for the Supreme Court case, Brown v. Board of Education, that would help outlaw segregation in the United States. And every year when he went on to teach at Yale and later at Columbia University, would hold an Armstrong listening night to honor the man who inaugurated this life-changing shift. Often the work of the arts can create a perspective-altering experience that is so private we forget what it goes on to do in public life. The racial regime that has put a stranglehold on American democracy is secured through a transformation of vision. We owe so much to the work of image makers such as Gordon Parks, who crafted new idioms to expand the narrative of who counts and who belongs in American life. But if you don't buy the argument, say, that art and culture matter for justice, why would, ask yourself, Sherrilyn Ifill and Bryan Stevenson, both lawyers, dedicate their time not to legal work, but to the narrative transformations that come from the work of culture? On the left, Bryan Stevenson is standing in the bowels of the Equal Justice Initiative National Monument to Peace and Justice, which he worked on for 8 years alongside his Supreme Court winning cases. Sherrilyn Ifill at right here at the Extraordinary Museum of Modern Art, alongside the Oracle Carrie Mae Weems, is working to understand how we live out the tenets of the 14th Amendment through the work of culture. If art doesn't matter for justice in American democracy, why would these images taken by Dorothea Lange, commissioned by the federal government to document the then legal policy of Japanese internment, have been hidden, impounded, and left out of the official record? If images don't matter for American democracy, why would this Life magazine spread, which you would have seen a year prior in opening up the issue after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, conscript photographs for civic instruction? Here you're seeing a spread to show how one could purportedly tell the difference between individuals, determine who was Japanese and therefore liable to have their rights stripped and sent to an internment camp. In a representational democracy, rights are many, but foremost among them is the right to be seen justly. This is what Douglass understood, and this is what made this image, taken by White House photographer Pete Souza, go viral. By a show of hands, how many of you know this image? Have seen it before? Nearly the entire room. So you all likely know what I do about the photograph, which is that he, Jacob Philadelphia, just 5 years old, at the center of the image, has been given the chance by his parents, who are to the left, permission to ask just one question of President Obama. And what is his question? Is my hair texture really the same as yours? And President Obama gallantly leans down to let him touch the evidence. And the cropping of the photograph, the epiphanic sun in the carpet, seems to rhyme with the epiphany that you imagine is happening in that young boy's mind. But you have to also ask yourself, what narratives at that young age of 5 had he been surrounded by through the work of culture that perhaps made him believe that his dreams were precarious, that he needed evidence to know that they were possible? I wrote The Unseen Truth to trace the work of the visual regime in American democracy. I could not have done so without signaling the work, without the image and work of Carrie Mae Weems. You're seeing here Mussolini's Rome, 2006, from the Roaming series. I wrote the book because, as we all know, the racial divide in American life is built on a fiction. But there was a time in American culture when we saw it, when we knew it, decided to disregard it and move on. The fiction of there being any basis for the idea of racial domination at all is the fiction I'm referring to here. The only way to convince people that a fiction is fact is to transform the visual regime surrounding them, to legitimate it. And this is what we have done. And it's turned our work as viewers, as judges, into daily political acts. We're living with the consequences today. The book tributes the early unsung heroes, such as Swan Marshall Kendrick, who worked in Woodrow Wilson's White House, and Freeman Henry Morris Murray, the first art historian to ever write about the relationship between art and monuments in the United States. It lets us look at spaces that allow us to slow down our gaze, such as Washington National Cathedral, and make vivid the work of visual culture to cohere and to dislodge racial myths. Martin Luther King Jr. is in this photograph standing, delivering his final Sunday sermon on March 31st, 1968, before his assassination. A week later, 4,000 mourners would attend his memorial service in the same space. It is a cathedral that once held as well stained glass windows dedicated to the Lost Cause narrative of the Confederacy. After remaining for 70 years, they were removed and works by Carrie James Marshall and words by Elizabeth Alexander were installed. When I went to the space, I noticed what had not been discussed, reported upon, which is that the tomb, the only president buried in Washington National Cathedral, in fact, the tomb of Woodrow Wilson, is directly next to these new stained glass windows. Vision, the work of seeing the full truth of this country, is the crucible of American democracy. And we must not shy away from these moments of tension that force us to extend our gaze. It takes so long for us to see, the canon at the cathedral said to me as we stood there, and he sensed what I was stating in my silence, my stunned silence. As I was writing this book, it became clear to me that we needed more works by the critics and lens-based artists of color whose work has been so vital for the work of American democracy. I knew two things. I could not do this work without two extraordinary colleagues by my side, Deborah Willis and Leigh Raiford. I knew as well that the first book from the Vision and Justice book series needed to be Race Stories, Essays on the Power of Images by Maurice Berger. I'm so grateful to Aperture and to the New York Times for publishing this volume. I'm grateful too to Agnes Gund and Darren Walker, who so generously supported its production. The brain trust of the advisory board allows for this to be possible. My last conversation with Maurice before he died was about the unseen truth and the extension of the work of the Vision and Justice Project. What is the role of art for justice in American democracy? Well, perhaps no one understood the answer more than Maurice. Few ever will. As a cultural historian, curator, and writer, Maurice's mission was a clear presentation of a complex idea about racial equality for the public. For a decade, he showed us extraordinary presentations through short essays in the New York Times, his column, Race Stories, how it is done. We have him to thank for the guides that we need, and I'm so honored that his work is the first volume of the Vision and Justice book series. He identified a critical part of the unfinished work in the history of race and representation, that of what you constitute today, the expanded audience needed to understand these ideas. He wanted to ensure that people within, and more importantly, beyond the art world, saw how we understand race through pictures today and have over time. He understood that, quote, racial literacy could come from visual literacy. This book is a primer. Each essay models how it's done. I look forward to speaking to you about the work it performs and where we can go with it in the future. Thank you.
Hi, and thanks to Sarah and the Vision and Justice group, and Roxana and MoMA for hosting this event tonight. This is an advanced copy of Maurice's book. The book is out next month, so watch for it. But what I'd like to do tonight is just talk a little bit about the book and Maurice and how this all came to be. I want to start with a quote. About 30 or so years ago, I was lucky enough to spend an afternoon with Rosa Parks while I was working on a project about photography and asking her how photography impacted her life, and this is some of what she said. When I was arrested December 1st, 1955, for refusing to give my seat to a white male passenger in Montgomery, Alabama, no photographers were present. The only pictures taken were mugshots at the police station. Fortunately, those pictures were not put in the paper, but my name and address and the area where I lived were often published. At the time of my second arrest in 1956, a photograph of me being fingerprinted was carried on the front page of the New York Times. And the day the buses in Montgomery were finally integrated, reporters from Look magazine waited outside my home until I got dressed, got into a car with them, and went downtown, where they had me get on and off buses so they could take the picture that has become so well known. Most people think that was my first arrest. So this is the Look magazine picture, and that's a reporter from UPI who was posed with her, to do this. I was amazed to have the opportunity to speak with her about this and the kind of issues that she raised, that Rosa Parks raised in our conversation about race and representation were also what fascinated Maurice, who, in fact, I met the year after I met Rosa Parks. Maurice was trained as an art historian. His thesis was on Robert Morris and minimalism, but soon became very, very involved in issues about race and representation. And he kept thinking about how and where art and race did and didn't intersect. In 1990, he wrote a very provocative essay in Art in America called Are Art Museums Racist? And it kind of went off like a bomb in the art world to people who were paying attention to it, and then the people who weren't paying attention to it were the people who didn't pay attention to these sorts of things. What Maurice realized was that art museums might not be the best place to talk about race. And so most of his career, he worked in university museums. From 1992 to 2020, he was a curator and a research scholar at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County at the Center for Art, Design, and Visual Culture, where he put together shows like Adrian Piper's first retrospective in 1999. Second view of that. MoMA did Adrian Piper's retrospective 18 years later. In 2003, Maurice did a show called White, looking at how racism and race were played out in the work of white artists who were trying to get people to reevaluate whiteness as a subjective point of view. And then he got very involved in civil rights and photography and came up with this project. It was a visual culture project called For All the World to See that was presented. Maurice came up with the idea to do this and pitched it to the Smithsonian. It was one of the first 3 shows done for the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And what's interesting about it is that rather than focus on art and artists, much of the work in the show was purchased on eBay and was about visual culture and was about the power of images as they get into the public at large. The show traveled widely. It went to ICP in 2010. In 2012, the National Endowment for the Humanities mounted a version of the show to travel in a project called On the Road, and it was so popular that they came up with 2 versions of it, and the show traveled until last year and went to 48 venues around the country. It was at libraries, it was at schools, it was in very public places. After the show happened at ICP, it was Gordon Parks' 100th birthday, his centenary, and nobody at ICP could figure out what to do, and they said to Maurice, "You want to do a window exhibition?" And so he did, and he put together a slideshow that was on 6th Avenue in New York, and it stayed up for a year. And while this was up, and he would go watch people on the street walking by it and realize that tens of thousands of people were seeing Gordon Parks pictures every day, he got interested in continuing to expand the audience for his work. So that's Maurice taking a picture of his own window. What happened because of this was Jim Estrin, who's a photographer and was the editor of the Lens blog, one of the two editors of Lens blog at the New York Times, asked Maurice if he'd like to write a column, and Maurice thought, yeah. Maurice, as a kid, grew up poor, lived in a housing project on the Lower East Side. He and his father would pick up copies of The New Yorker and Esquire from the gutter, and he would go home and read it, and he'd think, I want to be a writer. I want to be a public intellectual. And here was the New York Times saying, write for us. And so he did. This is for one of the first columns that he wrote for them. It was a monthly column, and he wrote from 2012 to 2019, and there's about 70 essays. Sarah mentioned the Frederick Douglass Pictures in Progress speeches, and here's something that she quotes in the introduction to her book that's of interest, I think. Douglass presciently articulated that the revolution of the new medium was as much about representation as perception. He would become one of the first American thinkers to make a case for the twofold political force of pictures as both object and prompt, a mental picture that could either reinforce or critique stereotypes. Douglass argues that the same medium that had been used to read the Negro out of the human family could be subversively used to read him back in. And that's what Maurice decided he would do. And what would happen was people at the times people would send books that were being published. There were exhibitions that were happening all over the country, not necessarily in the biggest museums. And he was able to write about things that he thought would be of interest. He was fascinated with the use of photography in Emmett Till's death and the publication of a picture of his body, but also Mamie Till Mobley's use of photography and literally saying, you know, I want all the world to see what I see. People should see this. Maurice started to champion the work of younger artists. He published Nona Faustine. He wrote often about Dawoud Bey, LaToya Ruby Frazier, a number of other people. He was fascinated with civil rights leaders' awareness and use of the media and how people presented themselves in the media. And wrote about Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, the Black Panthers in numerous pieces that he wrote. He was also interested in the beauty of African-American life and culture, and so wrote often about glamour and style. This was, this is a photograph of Shirley Bassey being fitted for a dress that's got 156,000 stones on it and weighs 28 pounds. He wrote about cultural memory and how cultural memory comes and goes. This is from a series of pieces by Carrie Mae Weems called Slow Fade to Black from 2010. As Sarah mentioned earlier, there was this sort of discovery of Dorothea Lange material that hadn't been seen much, so he wrote about those. And then he also was interested, there was this continuing interest in whiteness and how whiteness is and isn't questioned. So this was an essay about unquestioned whiteness on the left-hand side, with a photograph by Pete Mowney, and in the upper right-hand corner is a Wendy Ewald piece from a project she did called White Girls Alphabet. Maurice was fascinated with this picture. Every time he looked at it, he thought about what it was like for Robert Frank to be standing on that hill looking down at those people and what those people must have been thinking about him as it was happening. So he was very aware of social, cultural relationships and power relationships in photography, and was also amazed and horrified by what visuals communicated. And so this piece, When the Hoods Come Off, was of the Unite to Right rally, where white supremacists kind of took over Charlottesville, Virginia, and by pairing it with a Nazi rally, kind of made the point. He was fascinated, too, about how the media decides what we see and how we see it. So this was an essay about Gordon Parks' first Life magazine assignment called Harlem Gang Leader in 1948. So it shows the crop marks. He writes about the arguments the editors had among themselves, what they did show, what they didn't show, how the people represented were horrified by what happened. And so, the media was of interest to him. He wrote In his exhibitions, he included a lot of TV shows, he included a lot of film clips, so visual culture was what he was most interested in. And then back to this picture again, which is kind of irresistible. One of the things I love most about it was after this kid said, can I, is your hair like mine? Obama bent down and what he said was, touch it, dude. I want to end with something that Maurice said. This was a videotape when he won the ICP Infinity Award in 2018. This came out of the transcript for that videotaping. The camera is a remarkable tool of political persuasion and activism. The great photographers of race and civil rights understood it wasn't only about photographing someone getting hit over the head with billy clubs, bitten by dogs in Birmingham, or being thrown to the ground. The story of race, of civil rights, of identity is a big story. So I like to write about photographers who tell big stories, not just about the conflagrations, violence, and protests, but about what happens every single day in the lives of people. There's brilliance and beauty and profundity. It's all out there. I'm interested in writing about what is not normally written about in the mainstream press, about photographers who aren't famous enough, about issues of race that people are uncomfortable with. My greatest passion is to be an educator. How do you teach visual literacy, then racial literacy through visual literacy? And I'll end with the same picture that Sarah showed, because I'm kind of amazed to be standing here today. Maurice never talked publicly about his work. He only wrote, and that was the way the work got out in the world. But this is him at an event that Sarah organized it was at Harvard and Radcliffe in 2019, and this was a Gordon Parks exhibition that Maurice curated, and instead of pontificating to people, he would listen to people and speak with people. So this is a talk back at that event. So yeah, that's it. The book is out next month, and thank you to Aperture and the New York Times, and thank you tonight. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank all of you for being here for this extraordinary convening and forum. And thank you to Roxana and the department for convening this event. And congratulations, of course, to Sarah on the publication of a book of extraordinary and original scholarship that I think will do much to help us begin to unravel some of the current circumstances that we find ourselves in. And certainly congratulations on the publication of my dear brother Maurice Berger's book, brilliant scholarship that will now be available to a much wider audience. So I'm really appreciative to be here on this occasion. What I want to do is to just briefly spend some time talking about the history-based projects that I've been doing for the past 12 years. And looking at history as a way to provoke a conversation in the contemporary moment. This quote by Christina Sharp is something that continually informs the work that I do. How does one, in fact, memorialize a set of circumstances that continue to unfold? So, beginning with this book here, The Movement, which I first encountered when I was 11 years old, when my mother and father brought this book home after going to a lecture by James Baldwin in the church that I grew up in. They brought this book home and just left it where I could see it, which was probably more effective than telling me that I needed to look at it. And I did. The book was a book of photographs of and about the civil rights movement, and it was published by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, otherwise known as SNCC, as a fundraiser for the organization. And they had commissioned Lorraine Hansberry to write a text to weave these photographs together. There were a number of horrific photographs in the book. It was the first time that I had seen lynching photographs. And then there was this photograph of Sarah Jean Collins, which, when I first saw it as a young 11-year-old black boy, it seared its way into my psyche. And for a very long time, I would have periodic nightmares about this picture. I don't know that I entirely intuited at that point that some of that probably had to do with the fact that I was very much the same age as the young girl in the photograph. And she's photographed here in this picture in the immediate aftermath of the dynamiting of the 16th Street Baptist Church, which killed her sister, Addie Mae Collins, and 3 other girls. So this photograph is the beginning of all of the work that I've done for the past 12 years, because it provoked me to go to Birmingham, to begin to interrogate this history, to begin to think about how I might engage this history, how I might bring this history into a contemporary conversation. So I made my initial trip to Birmingham, had never been to Birmingham before, and began to spend time there thinking about how I might engage this history, visualize this history, make something that rose to the occasion of the depth of this history. And initially, after several years of visiting Birmingham, this project unfolded over years of meeting people, forming community with Birmingham, having the people in Birmingham get to know me, getting to know people in Birmingham. I came to this idea initially of making photographs of young people in Birmingham who were the same ages as the 6 young people who were killed on September 15th, 1963. Because in addition to the 4 girls, there were 2 boys, 2 young African-American boys who were killed later that day in acts of racist violence that was directly related to the violence that began with the dynamiting of the church. The girls who were killed in that dynamiting were, one was 12 and the other 3 were 14. And the 2 boys who were murdered later that day were 13 and 16. So once I realized through research at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute that these 2 boys were also a part of that history, I knew that whatever I did, I had to fold them into the conceptual shape of this project as well. And so starting initially with the idea of giving those 6 young people a less mythic, more palpable presence, I decided to make photographs of young African Americans in Birmingham who were the exact same ages as those 6 young people, which still didn't feel resonant enough for me. And after thinking about it for a while, I wanted to engage both the past and the present to create work that created a kind of liminality that was both simultaneously. And so I decided to make also portraits of African Americans in Birmingham who were at that moment the exact age that those 6 young people would have been had they not been murdered. This work began to set the conceptual shape of the work, of trying to engage history in a way that allows us to stand both in the present and to look back at and engage the past and to bring them together in a conversation. Along with the photographs, I also made a split screen video work about that morning, about September 15th, trying to visualize this history, trying to figure out how we might, through a kind of radical act of imagination, re-envision this history in order to engage with it. So having completed that project, I began to want to go back into the history that was directly related to the dynamiting of the church in 1963. That horrific moment is deeply rooted in the history of the encounter of African Americans, Africans who became African Americans, and their encounter with this country. And so I spent time in Louisiana looking at the path of fugitivity of African Americans who were escaping enslavement through the landscape of northeastern Ohio. The title of this work, Night Coming Tenderly Black, comes from Langston Hughes' poem, Dream Variations, the final couplet, Night Coming Tenderly, Black Like Me. And this idea of blackness being something tender. And I began to think about it as this tender black space that wrapped itself around these fugitive African Americans as they were moving through the landscape and ultimately towards Lake Erie and presumed freedom in Canada. The work also is a material conversation that is richly informed by the work of Roy DeCavava. For me, Roy DeCavava's notion of blackness as both subject, narrative, and material is something that helped me find the conceptual and material shape for this work. They're very large scale, very dark, and the appearance of them as objects is very much shaped by my experience of Roy DeCavava's photographs, which I'm assuming more than a few of you are familiar with. And as I continued to engage this landscape of fugitivity that I'm trying to reimagine and envisioning, I began to want to continue to trace my way back through this history to the plantation. The plantations, of course, are the site of the enslavement project. The African American position of slavery is both foundational to the American economy. It's also foundational to the reshaping of American culture through the introduction of African American traditions into this country. Everything from building traditions, architectural traditions, agricultural traditions, literary traditions, musical traditions. There's a whole history that sprang up on and from the plantation that profoundly reshaped the American landscape. And I wanted to create an intimate encounter with that landscape. I wanted to place the viewer in that landscape in order to envision this place of enslavement. And then again, in addition to the still photographs, there's a 3-channel film work that was made at Evergreen, again trying to amplify the experience of the plantation, what that felt like, what that looked like, to try to engage the senses around bringing this place into our space, not a space merely of history, but to bring this into our contemporary space. And then most recently, I spent time in Richmond, Virginia. Virginia, of course, is the epicenter of the enslavement project. And I spent time there photographing what's called by some the Richmond Slave Trail, and it's called by others the Trail of Enslaved Africans. But it is that trail that runs alongside the James River by which upwards of 350,000 African Americans were walked into slavery on this site. So I wanted to, again, create a sense of the immediacy of this experience, again, as if through the eyes of those enslaved Black bodies moving through this space, to put us there, to provoke us to engage with this experience, which is very foundational to the contemporary moment. And this is a two-channel film work made on that landscape that tries to envision both visually and sonically what history looks like, what history sounds like, to provoke an experience for the viewer that places them sonically inside of this history. I worked with a choreographer in Richmond, Gaynell Sherrod, and a sound engineer also in Richmond, to create this sonic landscape based on this idea of these 350,000 Black feet moving through this space, and then layering that sound into a cacophony of sound that I referred to as the sound of history. And then finally, as James Baldwin says, history is not the past, it's the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history. These are the words that continue to shape and inform and motivate the work that I do, and the work that I also hope will create for those who engage with the work the need to grapple and come to terms with history as we, again, try to figure out where we are and our way forward, because history has everything to do with these contemporary circumstances. Or, as I like to say, history explains everything. When people ask me why I do this work, it's to provoke a conversation around and about history. And why? Because history explains everything. And we can't come to terms with where we are now and how we, as a country, move forward without contending with and coming to terms with this history. And that's what I do and hope to continue to do as long as I'm still standing on my own 2 feet. Thank you.
Good evening. First, I just want to thank everybody for being here. Can you all just give yourself a round of applause for being here this evening? I'm thrilled to be a series editor with Sarah and Deb on the Vision and Justice imprint. I'm thrilled to be here to celebrate. Can we thank Sarah? Applause for Sarah. I also want to give applause to Marvin, Maurice's widower, who's been an incredible partner, shepherd of this project, and steward as well. And of course, thank you to everyone here at MoMA. What an incredible room of people, and I'm feeling very celebratory, and also I want to make sure that we have a place for rage as well, because we have to meet this moment. And so we are gathered here to reflect on the constellation of photography, democracy, and race in the US context. And so I want us to think a little bit about what we mean by American photography. By America, indeed, itself. America, as we often invoke it, refers to the United States, not to the Americas, North and South. America here refers to the 48 continental states, Alaska and Hawaii, but perhaps not the 14 territories over which the United States holds sovereignty, nor the nearly dozen countries that the US has invaded or occupied since 1945, including wars in Vietnam and Iraq. And America here certainly does not include Haiti, a country founded by people who refused slavery and for which they had been punished with more than 150 years of US invasion, occupation, blockades, abandonment, and most recently, scapegoating. Nor does America include the more than 50 years and more than $300 billion in military aid and economic assistance the US has provided to the Israeli ethno-state, including some tens of billions of dollars in the last year alone, aiding and abetting what numerous international organizations agree are war crimes, crimes against humanity, acts of genocide against the Palestinian people, and now against the Lebanese people and the people of Yemen, and. No, we often invoke America as singular, isolated, distinct, if not free of its global entanglements, or at least sanctified when it throws its dangerous weight around the world. America here also does not mean Lenape land, where we are gathered today. Ariella Azoulay has invited us to imagine that the origins of photography go back to 1492 in order to account for the ways photography developed with imperialism, the ways the camera made visible and acceptable imperial world destruction on empire's terms. So how do we make sense of photography that has worked to erase living indigenous peoples in the very process of documenting and archiving indigenous cultures? So what is American photography? It is difficult to think about American photography without thinking about the stories America tells itself about itself through photography. Its myths of contradictions, of empty lands filled with threatening people, of rugged individuals that project themselves into Matthew Brady's gallery of illustrious Americans, or those who brave untold dangers to coalesce into a melting pot, of endless possibility in the face of ever-increasing enclosure, of people at terms docile and hostile, industrious and lazy, eventually subdued, incorporated, co-opted. It is difficult to think about American photography without thinking about photography in the service of America, American empire, American dispossession of indigenous lands, American acts of genocide, American chattel slavery, American recourse to policing and incarceration to fix problems, whether the problem of Black freedom in the late 19th century or the 20th or the 21st, the problem of Japanese American citizenship in the mid-20th century, or the problem of protest and the right to free assembly. It is hard to think about American photography without thinking about the stories America tells itself about photography, of wild industry, intrepid invention, and endless innovation. of industrious white men, from George Eastman, inventor of Kodak, to Kevin Systrom, inventor of Instagram, who harnessed the frenzy of the visible to sell the people more and more versions of themselves at the cost of extractive labor across the world. It is then difficult to think about photography, American photography, without thinking about the ways photography has been deployed to produce America as a visualizable fact. That is, it is difficult to think American photography as untethered from the project of nation building. Photography's attempt to impose a singularity of purpose, to commodify difference in order to contain it. No matter how we might pluralize photography, the descriptor American has a disciplining function that imagines, indeed hopes, we speak with the same tongue, that we share the same desires, that we exist in the same time. And from our vantage point in 2024, as we witness and experience American decline, broken roads, broken political system, broken healthcare system, land on fire or underwater, civil wars left and right, rising rates of drug addiction, declining rates of life expectancy, broken people, the crisis of our national project. What does that tell us about American photography? Perhaps more importantly, what can photography tell us about the end of America? It is impossible to think about American photography without thinking of how photography has been practiced to casually ridicule, demonize, demean, or dehumanize, or as Sarah shows us, to falsely venerate. What is American photography to the enslaved, the indigenous, the immigrant, to those whose material and ideological labor, as well as their silence and dispossession, make America possible? It is impossible for me to think of American photography without thinking about the various visual resistances to that imposition of non-being, as Christina Sharp might say. Photography as a democratic, if not liberatory tool of self-representation, as Maurice sought to emphasize over and over. Photography as a mode of documentation of the brutalities experienced by non-white peoples under racial dictatorship, and also photography as an archive of possibility, affecting a rupture in the now and imagining other modes of living. So what is American photography to me, per Langston Hughes? At its best, it is Roy de Carava and Dawoud Bey's deep textured blacks that envelop their subjects in a protective darkness, away from the luminous glare of the camera's knowingness. It is Lorna Simpson's and Glenn Ligon's turned backs, a recognition and refusal of the power of an apparatus that surveils and celebrates in the same breath. It is Timothy O'Sullivan's 1862 Fugitive Negroes Fording the Rappahannock River, Virginia, a messy, discomforting photograph made in the chaos initiated by the Emancipation Proclamation for white audiences of its day. But for me, an unintended viewer, looking on more than 150 years later, I can only see Black people emancipating themselves, insisting on their own freedom. And I'm reminded that the photograph, the knowledge that the photograph produces, is never settled, never fixed. It is difficult to think of American photography without wondering what work that category does and for whom. Can we imagine a photography that opens up citizenship? And if we believe that those living in the wake of American empire, both within its borders and without, that is, in the ongoingness of the catastrophes that America has wrought, are also, then we have to ask, what is the work to be undone in the category of American photography? Put another way, how do we imagine a photography that will support our survival as a species and a planet, and not just as Americans? We have more than enough tools to imagine photography otherwise. Unseen Truth and Race Stories are two in front of us. And on this stage shortly, and in this room alone, are rich ideas. We are rich with ideas, but do we have the will? Thank you.
Hello, I'm joining you from a hotel room in Central Australia, and I'm really excited to be part of the event tonight. Thank you so much to everyone for organizing and including me. And I'm going to jump right in. Maurice Berger, among so many other contributions he made to how we understand American visual culture, taught us how photography could be used to both construct and deconstruct racism, both in its aesthetic and formal mechanics, as well as in its distribution and circulation in mass culture. One only has to think of his sensitive reading of a photograph taken by Gordon Parks on a 1956 trip to Alabama, where he was documenting the everyday life of Black residents in the Jim Crow South for a future piece in Life magazine. It depicts a woman named Joanne Wilson and her young niece standing in front of a movie theater under a neon sign brandishing the words "Colored Entrance." Maurice interviewed Wilson in 2013 for the New York Times Lens blog. Almost 60 years after it was taken, Wilson spoke with pride of her decision to appear in Park's series for the sake of advancing the cause of civil rights, a decision that did not come without risk. She told Maurice that her only regret was the fallen strap of her slip, visible on her upper arm. "I always wanted to look neat and nice," she said. "I did not want to be mistaken for a servant. Dressing well made me feel first class. I wanted to set an example." For Maurice, though, it was precisely this detail that made the photograph so powerful. Where at first a viewer might read the image with its stomach-turning neon sign solely through the lens of difference, as a record of the harsh conditions of racist segregation that may or may not ever touch her life directly, that errant strap allows for a moment of recognition, too. It is an index of the distraction that results from the everyday experience of a woman attending to a child, no matter her race. That poignant element for Maurice was an invitation to consider our shared humanity and an opportunity for empathetic identification, one that, in Park's hands, Maurice argued, could undermine the concept of difference itself. Maurice taught us, in effect, that by attending to the smallest details in a photo, we can start to unravel its ideological content when it came to race. We had to be detectives, in a sense, seeing past the surface, past the content of the image, to the underlying message, seeing past the mythology that the image is key in creating, for Roland Barthes. What Sarah Lewis argues in her book, it seems to me, is importantly different. She traces out a visual regime, one in which we have all been living without knowing it, in which the viewer is positioned as a judge. In the context of US white supremacy, and here I'll interject to say, I believe that what Sarah is tracing is extremely historically specific, not easily mapped onto, say, Australia, where I am now, where other models and languages and tools of white supremacy, no less pernicious and violent, prevails. But in this US context, it is a regime based on the shakiest of foundations. She writes that we were put in the position of evaluating people and their images to determine their claims to whiteness, and that the visual landscape required such a position. This empowerment, the way the image empowers us to act as judges, explains so much about the America we live in at the moment, an America that is sliding towards fascism and that is actively and unrelentingly participating in genocide and ethnic cleansing half a world away. Because this mechanism Sarah describes, which she analyzes in particular relation to race, has in fact seeped into every aspect of not only how we view the world, but how we conduct ourselves in the world. And in doing so, Sarah's argument reminds me of an interview in which Michel Foucault described the lure of fascism. He says, "Nazism and fascism were made possible only by the existence within the general population of a relatively large fraction willing to take on and be responsible for a certain number of state functions: repression, control, law, and order. When you think of the power of an individual that an individual could possess under a Nazi regime from the moment he joined the SS or became a party member, he could actually kill his neighbor, appropriate his wife and his house. The fact is that, contrary to what one usually understands by dictatorship, that is to say, the power of one individual, the dictator, in a regime like that, the most detestable, but in a sense, the most intoxicating part of power was given to a large number of people. In a regime like the Nazi regime, it is quite clear that there is no freedom, but not having freedom doesn't mean that you don't have power. So I will leave you with those words, and hope I haven't been too much of a downer. But thank you again for this wonderful invitation, and congrats to all for the great publications that we're celebrating tonight.
Hi, everybody. It's such a wonderful familial energy in the room. I'm so grateful for that. Thank you, Roxana, and all the team at the MoMA for making nights like this possible, convenings like this possible. And thank you, Sarah, and congratulations. But thank you for helping us in what seems to me to be a lifelong work of helping us all to see and think better. I'm grateful for your presence in the world. Marvin, I was so touched by what you had to say about Maurice, and found it so interesting what you said about his not having spoken in public about his work. It seemed that in your talking about him, you offered us a kind of photograph, a kind of offering of an image, a memorializing portrait that sort of multiplies the effects of a person in the world. And I'm very grateful to have been here for it. In the 8th chapter of my novel, which came out this year, it has a title which you might recognize. It's called Great Expectations. I borrowed it. A young man who is the protagonist, his name is, actually rhymes with the, very closely with the name of a famous artist. His name is David Hammond. And he is in Los Angeles visiting for the very first time. He is there working on, as a very junior staffer on a political campaign, that great symbol of, and at least promise of democracy. And he's there to work on a fundraising event. But before he gets to the event, he goes to the great spectacle, one of my favorite things in this country, the Rose Bowl flea market in LA. And he's walking around the flea market, looking at other people's stuff, dresses and little buttons and little triptychs, memento mori, and he's thinking about, on some level, the sadness of poking through this reminder of someone else's possible death, that people leave things behind. And in this process of poking through what people leave behind, he comes across an estate sale of photographs. And one of the photographs, which never appears in the book but is quite closely described in the book, is a photograph that looks like this one. And after sort of forensically looking across the surface of the photograph, he alights on the figure of the person that he assumes to be the father, this guy with wavy hair and vampire's eyes. I should intervene myself now and say that I too once went to that flea market, although I was much older than David was in the moment of this novel. And I was there with a friend, an artist, and he was telling me that he often went to look at photographs like these just in search of new compositions and things to think about art, new ways to look at people and perhaps to look at Americans. And I brought that picture home. It's now sitting on the desk where I write. And I would often, as I wrote, even if I wasn't writing about photographs, just look at the picture. I was, I don't know, entranced by the sweetness of these girls and the obvious sort of warning intelligence of the person that I assume to be their mother on the right of the composition, and the kind of wild, omnidirectional gaze of the woman that I think is the grandmother. But yes, also crucially, this figure, the father, I could never tell what era this photograph emerged from. It was somebody else's. It had been lost in one way or another. But I kept thinking about, I don't know, something about the attitude of the picture made me keep on thinking about the 1920s. And on some level, the father with his sort of obvious self-satisfaction and his tan reminded me so much of Scott Fitzgerald. Some of my favorite works by Fitzgerald are his comic short stories about a disappointed screenwriter who scurries around the lots of the great studios looking for work and bumming lunch off of his friends and sort of surfing the wake of his disappointment with that industry. That is an echo, a comic echo of Fitzgerald's actual experience, and I wondered whether this could be a man like Scott Fitzgerald, happy, on the run perhaps from his roots in the East, on the verge of a disappointment but not knowing it yet. But then I thought, just staring at this photo over and over, I might still think about the 1920s, but this guy does not have to be black. I mean, does not have to be white, that is. I thought a lot about one of my favorite writers, Jean Toomer, looking at this photograph. Jean Toomer, the writer of the seminal work, something that a lot of my work implicitly, I think, grows out of a book of poetry and narrative and drama called Cain. Toomer was always running from his roots in blackness. His father was a formerly enslaved man, and his mother was descended from free people of color. His maternal grandmother was a man named Nathan P.B.S. Pinchback, the first African-American governor of any state. But if you look at, again, a photograph of Nathan Pinchback, you will not think that you are looking at a black man. He looks like the pictures of, have you ever looked at a picture of the founder of an HBCU? They all look like better groomed versions of Tim Walz. Crucially, the fact of blackness is not necessarily visual, but it is, as with my engagement with this image, interpretive. Anyway, I thought about Toomer, who, yes, was a writer, but also later in his life became kind of a blowhard, kind of a spiritual entrepreneur who would give lots of speeches and gather small group of acolytes who would live in his house in Pennsylvania, and part of their spiritual task, very helpfully to him, was to help him clean his house. And he had a ritual, which later became purely an adjunct to his sort of encroaching alcoholism, which was called deserving time, where after all the work, didn't everybody deserve a drink? And I thought about this picture as an example of the moment just before that deserving time goes sour. Pretty soon I realized that what I had done to this photograph in my mind, on my desk as I wrote, was to make it a fiction. And so I felt that I needed to incorporate it into the work of fiction that I was writing. And I realized that it does have something to do, as David thinks, as he's walking through this market, with loss, not only the loss of an item, but potentially in these two fictionalized versions of writers I love, how we are all, on some level, fugitives from our origins, on some level, fugitives, just like a lost photograph, from our originary meanings. That interpretation, new ways of looking critically, on some level make us more free. I thought a lot as I wrote about this photograph and then many other photographs. That chapter is all descriptions of photographs, about how art, and specifically photography, is, among other things, evidence of a disaster. That disaster is not always political, although it sometimes is political, and it is not always personal, although it is sometimes also that, but it's existential. The plain fact that we are met with so many beautiful and often harrowing impressions as we walk through our lives, and that often what we call our memory is just a cutting from that great stream of impressions, just a few shards that we can rescue from that onslaught. But it seems to me that interpretation, not just new images, but new ways of looking at images, is a way to perhaps reverse that trajectory. That interpretation helps us to take back from loss and its tendency to reduce itself to just one image. And it can instead send us off into a new multiplicity of images. Give us back the true plurality that we feel in all of our lives, multiply the textures of our lives. I was thinking as I was sitting in my seat that the first time I ever very nervously spoke in this room was 8 years ago, and I was moderating a panel about diversity in art spaces. I think this is the first time I met Sarah, actually, after that panel. Diversity in art spaces and on the walls of museums like this one. But it seems to me that as that work, that necessary work continues, perhaps a more exponential method, technology of multiplication is not just more images, but more ways of looking at images. This is perhaps my argument for criticism as a necessary adjunct to art, that the one way to figure or to define democracy and justice in this in a context like this one is to see doubly and then triply and then over again until we make, with our vision, a new world. Thank you.
Good evening. A lot of thoughts and a lot of original ideas in the room, and I'm still processing most of it. I am honored to be here. It is a privilege to be here, not only as a panelist, but also as a student of Sarah Lewis and Roxana coach. So I'm just going to get into my presentation because I have a lot of slides to mentally massage with you all. Oh, sorry, let me go back to this. This is my topic for tonight. Like I said, I would first like to thank Sarah Lewis, Roxana coach, MoMA, and everyone who's contributed to this wonderful panel discussion. I would like to explore the visual legacy of the pioneering American Muslim human rights activist Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, also known as Malcolm X, a figure of personal inspiration and complex cultural significance. Amongst the constellation of things he serves as a metaphorical prism of faith, human dignity, transformation, and a vessel for truth. When we think of Malcolm X, he is often synonymous with the civil rights activism and radical change, especially during his time as a leading national recruiter and organizer with the Nation of Islam. Beyond his powerful speeches and writings, however, lies a lesser-known aspect of his legacy, his role as a visual storyteller, which depicts his sense of humor, love for his wife and children, and a compassion towards strangers and close friends. Let's see. Malcolm was a visionary image maker and a master of public relations, deeply attuned to the power of visuals and the symbolism of his era. Confident, charming, cool, and enlightened, Malcolm X was acutely aware of his public persona. He carefully curated his appearance and demeanor to project a powerful and yet charismatic image. He often carried his own camera, which Gordon Parks describes as his method of, and I quote, collecting evidence. Malcolm trusted photographs to offer visual proof of Black Muslim industriousness and composure, countering the sensationalized headlines and biased reports that often distorted their reality in the mainstream media. He collaborated with renowned photographers like Eve Arnold to create positive images of Black Muslim community, often, quote, often as a ghost art director or composing the images that the mainstream media was so eager to publish. In other words, he helped the outside reporters craft images with purpose. Remember this one? His photographs often convey a sense of defiance and resilience in the face of oppression. These stark, often black and white images capture timeless, iconic moments, from speeches to community interactions, blending his personal narrative with the political statements. Each photograph documents his personal, spiritual, and intellectual evolution. His early images reflect his time with the Nation of Islam, portraying him as a stern figure of religious authority. His later images, particularly after his break with the NOI, show a more nuanced figure open to broader ideas about race, identity, class, and global solidarity. Malcolm X's visual legacy continues to inspire and influence a new generation of thinkers, creatives, and activists across the globe. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, his resurgence signaled that his image had become mainstream and, dare I say, sanitized enough to appear on mixtape, album covers, posters, postage stamps, and other forms of ephemera. This marked an iconic paradigm shift. The same American government that had once imprisoned, harassed, and surveilled him has now offered its unofficial seal of approval. His images remain relevant today, serving as a rally point for social justice movements, from prison reform to protest following the tragic murder of George Floyd, demonstrating the power of images to shape collective memory and understanding. In parting, I quote Maurice Berger when I say, Malcolm's passionate engagement with photography, end quote, and his role as a visual storyteller is an essential part of his legacy. His photographs not only document his life and times, but also serve as powerful symbols for resistance, empowerment. And this is my personal favorite photo of him. But I just wanted to go back to point out these two depictions of him, one made by Avedon and one made by Gordon Parks. Probably, my guess is, I think they're in the same year, probably months apart. I found the actual date for that image, and I just thought, like, what an interesting way to depict, this leader, both by different artists and thinkers, and I don't know. I just keep coming back to these images. And like I said, this is one of my favorite images of him. I've had the privilege of actually going to Cairo to the same mosque that this image was made. And yeah, I leave you with that. Thank you so much.
Good evening. Roxana's cue for me was to say a few words about public writing, particularly writing about images of different kinds, but public writing and the ongoing project of American or USian democracy. And I'm going to get to that in an extremely short presentation because I know we're also heading towards deserving time, dear Vincent. and we're going to deserve. But I'm going to start, if you don't mind, with a family story. There's a story that my parents tell about finding a place to rent in Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1967. They had driven from California, where my father had completed his postdoc. My mother was very pregnant with me. They had attended the March on Washington in 1963 to their lasting pride, but they didn't really know the city. So they had heard about Georgetown, which sounded nice, but the real estate agent insisted that they'd be more comfortable elsewhere. So they landed in a mostly black neighborhood, actually a few blocks away, dear Professor Lewis, from where, as I see in your book, Frederick Douglass lived in the 1870s on A Street. My mother is Jewish American, my father is Indian. He's light-skinned, as Indians go, but in those days he sported wild hair like a guerrillero or maybe a yogi. So they had been deputized into gentrification by an agent, a real estate agent, who was deputized or deputized himself to enforce the unsaid racial order, including by interpreting outliers and aberrations and dispatching them accordingly. This participates in what Professor Lewis calls racial detailing. The concept captures how the work of racial enforcement and racial capitalism, ultimately, is dissembled by the idioms of market and state and carried out by myriad individually trivial players. When I was 6 years old, we left the US and we moved to France, where there was a whole new kind of slotting to perform into Gaullist social democracy with its own racial and colonial silences. But if I skip now to the present, as a US person with some kind of US cultural platform, I am reminded here of how racial detailing shaped my subject position from the very outset. What's happening now is less and less subtle. In the 1960s, racial capitalism was temporarily, to some degree, on the defensive. Following the catastrophe, the Nakba, if you will, in 1980, which is the rise of Thatcher and Reagan and the global spread of their ideologies, unchecked since then, it retooled. In the 2020s now, it is rampant, with basically two authorized positions in the societies of the West. One, a new, incipient technological fascism, and the other, liberal prevarication and complacency. So we gather here, both under and against the latter rubric, and also in election season, where, given the binary anti-democratic United States system, any act or statement of refusal of all this is bound to draw opprobrium. So this is also a time of great moral crisis due to the prevention, prohibition, and punishment of any act or statement of solidarity with the Palestinian people. We have seen it in the universities. Many of us know how similar dynamics are at play in the art market and indeed in art institutions, policing and silencing curators, educators, and artists. And the longer this continues, the more, of course, it infects and reinforces other topics. Moral crisis does not demand moral certainty, but it definitely, absolutely demands moral clarity. In perusing Maurice Berger's essays, I remember reading many at the time of their writing and publishing. Indeed, we sometimes covered the same shows of the same artists, and then some of them again later, after his passing, but when they set a benchmark from my more recent writing. It's a critical benchmark, but also a moral benchmark. Maurice wrote with purpose and rigor, and in the concise format of the Lens blog, he got to the point. His piece on Dana Schutz's Open Casket, which Marvin showed an excerpt of in the presentation earlier, for instance, cut through all the intramural New York on New York art world polemics. Looking back, in fact, I would submit that Open Casket was an index of crisis in the field. There was certainly debate, national debate, as Aruna D'Souza points out in Whitewalling, on, quote, who art is for, the responsibilities of art institutions to their audience and of artists to theirs, who is granted the right to speak and paint freely, what censorship is, and who has the power to censor. And yet, very few contributions in the public writing realm, that is to say, in broad circulation and what really floated around in the heat of the controversy, as opposed to in academia and so forth, very few of those contributions, if any, even mentioned Elizabeth Alexander's key essay on the question of looking at Emmett Till. None, perhaps until Aruna the following year, mentioned the book published 2 months before the biennial that confirmed that Carolyn Bryant had lied. Even worse, nothing published during the controversy addressed how the actual casket had gone on view a few months earlier at the NMAHC in Washington, D.C., let alone the special regime for viewing it there. And therefore, much further from view was the whole question of Emmett Till's ongoing unsettled afterlife as it continues to play out in Mississippi. So where now will connections such as those be made? Maurice Berger is gone. The Lens blog is gone. The Village Voice and all the city weeklies and all the other cities are gone. Greg Tate is gone. Serious cultural coverage in the regional press, and what's left of the regional press, is basically gone. The problem is not talent. There's loads of talent. The problem is definitely not subject matter. There's an abundance of subject matter. The scarcity is artificial, which means it's political. To resurrect public writing that actually reaches the public in a time of moral crisis becomes a political project. I just got back from Venice. Tomorrow I'm going to be in Alabama. For my part, I find it important to continually switch scales, to get far away from the US and to burrow deeper and deeper into it. In this time of political and moral bankruptcy, I look ever more towards artists and art workers, activists and agitators for cues and inspiration. I hope we can continue to think with them in public. If not, we'll do it in private. One thing is for sure, the struggle continues.
Thank you. Thank you, Roxana. Thank you, Sarah, Leigh, and all of Aperture to support Maurice Berger, who is a dear friend and means the world to me to have this book out. He called me the weekend before he passed to say, Deb, take care. It's dangerous out here. I'm upstate, and I'm going to stay safe. And he encouraged me always to think about my work and storytelling. So I was really happy to see Ava DuVernay starred with I'm a Storyteller, because Maurice Berger was and still is a storyteller for us. But thinking about this gathering, so it's important to think about photographs. And so I want to start off with the role of how critical the role of photography is to as a photographic object. But I just want to share a moment that was sent to me last week. This is Deb Willis in 1974. A photographer called my assistant and said, "Is this Deb Willis?" I attended Duke Ellington's service at St. John's, and I always thought about that because it was such a moment for me when we think about empowerment and thinking about dress. I have 10 slides and I have 5 minutes. I'm going to walk through these moments, but I always think in terms of storytelling, how important it is for photographers to consider collecting photography as object, but also as storytelling moments, and to think how, to understand photography, how it's shaped by women, women who decorate their homes, think about their families, think about fashion and dress. We think Jeannie Mutusame Ash is looking at in Dafuski Island to think about the importance of family members, the importance of memory through segregation. So when I think in terms of merging social concerns and aesthetic concerns, I'm always happy to think about how women played a crucial role in thinking how important it is for Black photographers to document and also to think about how do we tell a story about oppression and joy, protest and dissent, dignity and pain, resilience and survival, while creating new visual symbols that inspired a movement. And we look at this woman who's taking her son to integrate a school. She's ready. She made her dress. You can see that bow on the back. She's making a statement about armor. So she sees dress as armor. She's ready. Her son has his cuffed jeans on. There's auntie and grandma there together. But then that battle of that woman, arms standing at the steps, that she's going to stop these three powerful women. And this is an important way. How do we think about pictures would tell stories of strength and beauty? To think about images of hostility and anger, but to think about how Cecil Williams could talk about a mother who's outside of a place, the mission, but also to think about how she's thinking how to talk about integration. How do we document care for children during this time? But how to think about Richard Saunders' photograph of Malcolm X at the Natural History Museum here in New York, teaching about this portrait, this bust that we all know through history. And it's an amazing story to imagine this teacher that we all know as this political leader. And I was so happy to see Walsh share that moment, but also to see this story. What is he saying? And look at those young women who are listening closely to this moment. So when we think about beauty and strength and hostility and anger, but also the promise of a world free of racism, these are moments that stop you, such as Gloria Richardson. I mean, look at her, push that gun away from me. She is determined to go ahead and with her life moving forward. But we see her beauty, her strength, but she's like just unbothered by this man, this policeman or National Guardsman, but she's shoving away from her body. That's strength and that's beauty. We see here with John Mosley in Philadelphia, Dr. King is speaking on a Saturday afternoon in August in Philadelphia. But look at these young people and older people in this photograph. The photographer is able to see mothers with their heads with head wrap, but also with curling irons in their hair, the curling irons in their hair. We see them, curling, rolling, whatever they're called now, but their hair getting ready for the night. But they are here in the day ready to hear Dr. King, and she's there. But the joy that these people hear and see that there's hope within this expression that they are dealing with the social concerns in Philadelphia. We also see James Hinton's photograph of two women on the subway. This is this ebony issue that's a powerful issue from a time in the past. But here in the New York Times, Vietnam's story on the front page, women who are on the subway sharing a moment, but then also Doris Derby's image of a young girl who cannot enter into a department store, but looking through the window, looking at the clothes that she desires, the dolls that she desires. And there is an opportunity for her aunt, her grandmother, her mother, to look at that photograph and make a dress in relationship to that desire of this young girl. So when we think this sense of empowerment and activism. And we see with Horace Ove, Walking Proud, this is during a celebration of Carnival in London. And so we see style as a moment to introduce, life in London during this period of, celebration with Carnival, with migration. We think about these stories. And then also with product design. And we think about advertising in the 70s, and this is Ernest Russell, this is Legacy Russell's dad's ad. We think of Duke, when we think about the Hollywood experience, but then also the pride that this young woman shows in terms of how advertising and advertisers during that period made a difference in Black life, made a difference in family life. This is Barbara Dumet's image, where she's looking at a Black doll, a little girl is holding a Black doll, and then she's carrying it is an everyday thing. And then here's craft, mac and cheese, moments of joy in this family. But how, when we think about and reconsider the critical role photography played, we're also thinking about how the evidence is shared through documenting these moments. And then I just wanted to end with me, attending this moment of Deborah Willis in 1974. But then I see Gerald Straw. I don't know if anyone's here from the 70s, but here I am just still an undergraduate student, and I am in this world of documenting and sharing this moment. And I want to say thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Roxana, for having this opportunity to share these 10 slides about, beauty, about love, and about a world and hope of the promise of a world free of racism. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. So I wrote something down while everyone was talking, while listening, of course, to all of you wonderful people. I am actually just generally a little bit in awe of all of you. I've known you all from afar, and a couple I've met from working with either writing or Dawoud. I've gotten to know a little bit, and yeah, what a pleasure it is. So thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Roxana. This is I think very differently about film and photography. I've come to know from other people telling me than most people. And here's kind of a little taste of the way that I think. And I'm using this opportunity kind of as a way to sort of drop a blueprint, maybe for those who are kind of wondering how to approach making images that are dealing with the complexity of Blackness. So hope you enjoy. This is very experimental. I would never show this to any other group of people. A lung submits to anxiety and smog, a heart to love and cholesterol. All sense of truth passes through the body. People are the real documents of civilization, and one's eyes are made for the field of events. Things come in as this and are processed into that, while most melt aimlessly in one's memory, others cling to totems in their sky. In this personal storm of consciousness, the act of looking makes a mirror of meaning. Instinct is infused with culture, a reflex by which nothing can be understood until it's adjusted. Throw in a camera, and the fiction's entombed. Alas, the big bang of photography and film burst forth in a Eurocentric imaginary. Money's to be made and othering to behold. Point, shoot, and capture. Repeat after me. The god of the camera is a colonizer. Hey, look here. The rest is history. The receiver of this gaze dies a certain death, a peculiar death of the imaginable. In the American matrix, I've been framed black. In your case, maybe something else. These varying degrees of death are often presented as varying degrees of life. The camera should come with a caution label embossed on the lens cap. I am not concerned with verisimilitude. I help you believe. Believe what? The chops of American culture have always licked, especially for Black folks. A people ready-made, a billion limbs, Fluids of filled souls and house hands alike, dripping their weather in soup and crop beds across the nation, built up the immunity to my total consumption. Chomp, a photograph of easy reading. Sip, a film without reflexivity. Gulp, a look over yesteryear's horizon reveals photography and film as the technology of racism. The material form of racial representation, a visualization of the concept in question, is necessary for its initial engagement. But a cul-de-sac of history of exploitation is held in black skin. How do you attend to the problem that is the visualization of itself? Read non-Cartesian sums. Reset your relationship to Western knowledge formation. Resist most logic. Only your experience has irreducible singularity. Most logic is functional and conditioned. Welcome the dream. Develop a photographic sensibility. Make the camera an organ. Take it into your body. Shoot towards a personal poetics. Consider the visual story of blackness. Phrenology to blackface, to Kodak, to blaxploitation, iconicity to non-iconicity. Unsuitcase black images. Remove them from the luggage of the traveling salesman. Fail at representing blackness. The act of representing blackness is the act of producing. The less black, the more black. Reading skin is a game, a skin game. It's the recursive interplay between what is observed, remembered, desired, feared, imagined, misunderstood, reconsidered, recalled, observed, remembered, desired, feared, imagined, misunderstood, reconsidered, recalled, observed. Blackness is content. It's a skin game. Break the social construct with mainstream blackness. Locate and avoid the stock use of blackness. Disautomate the consumption of blackness. Embrace the ambiguous, complex, decontextualized, recontextualized, fragmented black image. Employ recumbency, eye contact, obstruction, concealment, and iterations of time. Embrace contradiction. Dismiss contradiction. The seduction of blackness is not the mystery of its engagement, the range of possible new knowledge encountered, but the proximity to its icons. Point otherwhere, be elsewhere. Find the circadian rhythm of blackness. Start with the quotidian. Produce new icons of blackness. Use strategic formalism. Question all indexical iterations of race. Is there a visual vaccine against racism? Can the fractured, astray black image act as a probiotic to a racist pathology? Aim for a black involution. Blackness is unstable and evolves alongside our participation in its acknowledgement. Collapse it to expand it. Create the black dictionary. That's me. Representational death owes human ingenuity a dramatic intervention, as the lens-based portrait can relay humanity and reinforce inferiority to the desire of the viewer. Images have no heart. They are candy for the mind. In film, the tamed, stringy image employment in narrativizing makes even more clear the issue at hand. The reality-textured, reproduced moment carries an encyclopedia of content, the background existing as the foreground for some, the maintenance of much with the alleviation of little. For the over-relied upon sake of genre and theme, industrial cinema requires the spaying and neutering of images within the film body. This is a cannibalistic act. The complexities of a race-based reality have outgrown these traditional structures of story and narrative that gnaw them into palatability. Their genealogy, subtractive, their comfort with more death. Unable to reconcile the necessities for a responsive, formal embodiment of the content with antique structure, story, and character arc demands, this cinema entertainingly dissuades critical thought while producing status quo belief encounters, and in turn, belief systems. If form is content and blackness is content, then blackness is form. Blackness must not be separated from its form. If blackness/form is unstable and evolving, then the ideas of structure and narrative must evolve correspondingly to accommodate. The site of the image in a time-based chain of interpretation must remain fertile. Shelve the Victorian model of narrative arc and structure, or let it respond transformatively to the content. Consider the indecisive moment. Free the reproduced event from the essentialization of narratives and story. Find the epic banal. Bring elation to the experience of blackness. Acknowledge the magnificence of the universe's encasement in the social, awaiting other forms. Lean towards experience creation. Most logic and blackness are in constant debate. Create the personal poetic experience of blackness. Renew the encounter. Use music as mentor. What music does, the universe is. Embody this musicality. Its being, forms, it's a liquid organization. Its escape from reason and its need to justify itself, or be dance. Incomplete the work. Default to re-signifying. Require joint meaning making. Viewer plus work equals instance of finished work. Reach the mainstream with non-industrial image production. Work outside of industrial time and factory processes, and beyond the arthritics of the old avant-garde. Time becomes the new medium, a clock measuring the long macro draw of a racial gesture left out, its meaning and respite for a pacemaker's lifespan or two. Weather and sculpture, iterations of time in the phenomenon called blackness, in America suspension, a mountain to its knees, a movement towards the present, an acquired taste for images and films of their own volition. Shout out to Jocelyn Barnes, who's here, my collaborator, Kimberly Drew, and Remy Olabengo. Thank you.
Okay. Well, we're so grateful to have had this time to celebrate the community that we are together. When you have a set of serial presentations, you're reminded that none of us do this work alone. We do this work side by side. And every time I spoke with Maurice in person, the man who was always by his side was Marvin. We could not have put together Race Stories without your care and your love. It's fitting to me that we'll be able to end this gathering with the time to celebrate the love that's here. I know he would be thrilled that we've come together in this way. Thank you. Thank you, Marvin. Thank you. And we have a few more remarks from the incredible Roxana Markoch.
We did plan to have a Q&A session, as you can see, but we have reached the conclusion of our time, but not the conclusion of our conversations that I invite you all to have with us over a reception, just up the escalator, one flight. We will be joining you in 5 minutes. It will allow us to do a group portrait. So thank you all so much. We are incredibly grateful to the brilliant speakers today who have, brought together their views on this incredible interlacing between images, race, democracy, and the unsilencing of history. Thank you all for joining us.